Imagine that you're 17 years old, you have a family that doesn't have the resources to live comfortably. You grew up in a neighborhood where violence and poverty weren't occasional, they were normal. One mistake, one bad decision, as maybe skipping school too many times, getting caught with substances, or being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and now you are sitting in a correctional facility in Georgia. You hear about a rehab program that could help you. It teaches job skills, offers therapy, and even helps you prepare for the GED. You are interested and you want to change. But then you learn that that program is not available in your area as there's not enough funding and you might not even be eligible. And just like that, hope starts to fade. You feel stuck. According to a 2019 report by the Department of Juvenile Justice, 74% of reoffenses occur within the first year of release. In Georgia, juveniles have a 65% chance of reoffending within 3 years of leaving the system. Rehabilitation for juveniles is not just important, it's essential. These programs are just about building pathways out of cycles of poverty, crime, and incarceration, from lack of funding and eligibility restrictions to a justice system still rooted in punishment over progress. We'll look in this episode at how we can improve and expand the resources already available and its barriers.
Hi, my name is Mari Lewis.
Hello, my name is Isabel Mopuchino.
Hi, my name is Dani Sorna.
Hi, my name is River Spiva.
And this
This
is
is
the
the
Journeys
Journeys
Home
Home
podcast. Stay tuned for more information about rehabilitation efforts in the state of Georgia. In 1992, incarcerated individuals in Georgia lost eligibility for student loans. In 1994, they lost eligibility for Pell Grants. In 1995, they lost their eligibility for Hope Scholarship, and in 1998, with the codification of the Zell Miller Scholarship, incarcerated individuals lost their eligibility there too. Prison education has always been a controversial subject. Often funded by taxpayer dollars, many people do not see the need in paying to educate the incarcerated population, as many of them are seen as unproductive members of society. Despite this, nonprofits such as Common Good Atlanta work to bring upper education to prisons and transitional centers in the state of Georgia in order to increase effective rehabilitation and decrease recidivism rates. Common Good Atlanta alumni have a 0.05 recidivism rate as compared to Georgia's recidivism rate of 30%. Professor Margaret Pendergrass, a theater lecturer and professor at Common Good Atlanta, joined us to discuss the benefits of prioritizing prison education despite the controversy. She actively works to bring theater and poetry into prison, and she is here to talk about the importance of her work.
Welcome to the Journeys Home podcast. Today we have Professor Margaret Pendergrass with us. Thank you so much for being here, Margaret.
My pleasure. So I teach in the Department of Theater and Performance Studies. I'm a senior lecturer there. I've been at Kennesaw, I think, longer than probably you all have been alive. So I started teaching there part-time in 2004. And my main courses I teach in the department are more what I would call writing-centered courses. So some of the academic courses of analysis, and then also creative courses in terms of performance composition, playwriting, personal narrative, things like that. I also really enjoy my privilege to work with Kennesaw students, my students, to create new works. I do a lot of adaptations and of classic works and sort of refiguring them. And I would say, particularly in the last 5 years, doing work in community, working in different communities, specifically mostly working with incarcerated people, both teens and adults, and doing what I would call applied theater. So the idea of doing theater in non-theatrical spaces, non-typical spaces, and the performance is always part of it, but it's not necessarily the most important part of it. So it's very process-driven, and it's a way to really use the tools of theater more than just entertainment, although just entertainment is actually really hard to do, but to create community, to build voices, to give people a platform to speak that particularly often don't have a real platform to speak, and for us to engage in dialogue around who we are as humans, around questions of history, around just the nature of art, all the big stuff, why we're here, things like that.
So you said a lot about art and, uplifting voices that are not often heard. When we think about recidivism and when we think about criminal justice, art is not usually a part of the conversation. So first, I want to ask you, you are a part of Common Good Atlanta. Why did you choose to be a part of this? And then also, why did you choose art as your pathway to helping out with reducing recidivism rates?
there's a lot built in there. So I want to pause for a second to say, well, what is Common Good Atlanta? Common Good Atlanta is an organization, not for profit, based out of Atlanta, that has been working for about 15 years, providing education for incarcerated people in the Georgia Department of Corrections, the Georgia system of prisons. I got involved with Common Good Atlanta to bring in. I was doing a production of Our Town at Kennesaw, and speaking about someone who was involved with Common Good Atlanta, and they said, "Oh, wouldn't it be cool to bring in your students and do some scenes from Our Town and do it with the classes?" And it was a humanities class, critical thinking and writing, and we had an engagement. It was really powerful. It was powerful for our students. It was powerful for the Common Good students. It just reminded me why I love theater, because theater is something that happens in a room, and people share something, they work together on something, and then have a conversation. And I could see sort of in that moment how we all were changed by the experience. And I don't know, I know that there are other ways to do that, but I think theater is a really powerful technology for bringing people together from very different points of view, from very different backgrounds, from very different life circumstances, and giving us a way to meet each other kind of in a new space, in a different space. And it's just fun. I don't know. I don't know of anything that's more fun than that. So that got me thinking about, and I loved working with the Common Good students. They and I think anybody who teaches within a prison context will tell you that your best students are going to be your incarcerated students, because they're so passionate about it. They don't take education for granted. They bring something to every conversation. And that's a general statement, but I've seen it, true again and again. All to say that in terms of the work with Common Good Atlanta is really focused on education and bringing education to people that may not have access to higher education. The initial intent was not necessarily driven by, and I would say the continuing intent is not necessarily driven by the idea of trying to bring down recidivism rates, although that is certainly something that happens. And, in terms of, I'm not sure what the national recidivism rates are at this point, or in Georgia, I think it's probably around 40% or higher. But at Common Good Atlanta, it's like 0.5%. So there is a real effect. And I think there are lots of reasons for the effect. Some of them are complex. But the point is, I think that bringing people access to higher education and what that does. It's complicated, but I think that it's very rewarding. And I think some of the most profound impacts that I have seen have been on the college students, sort of seeing and being part of that. And then that experience, both I work with a lot of students who are theater majors, obviously, but then also students from criminal justice and other disciplines who are a little suspicious, I think, when they start the program, but then are really affected by it in positive ways.
You said that you involve criminal justice students. I want to give our listeners some context. So basically in Georgia currently, 1 in every 33 American adults is under correctional control, whether that be currently imprisoned in a transitional center or on parole or pardoned. So that is a staggering number, but specifically for Georgia, 1 in 33 American adults is under control, but 1 in 13 in Georgia is currently under control, because Georgia is the 9th largest total population and 4th largest total population inmate control. So that's a staggering statistic to look at. You are saying that you are involving criminal justice students to be in your classes, these theater-driven, these art-driven classes, and we're seeing that your Common Good Atlanta students have a 5% recidivism rate compared to the rest of Georgia. So why do you
0.5%?
0.5? Why,
Less
that's
than less than 1%. Yeah.
that's amazing. So I want to know, like, why do you incorporate your criminal justice students into this process, this very successful process?
Well, I have to credit my colleague in criminal justice, Dr. Tanya Link. She is the assistant chair of the Department of Criminal Justice, and we met several years ago in a faculty learning community on yoga, of all things. And then when I started doing work with Common Good Atlanta, and I was looking to partner with other professors from Kennesaw, I was like, I'm going to reach out to Tanya and see if she's interested, because I knew she had done work in the past bringing Kennesaw students into classes, people within the jail system within Cobb County, and she was doing classes that follow something called the Inside Out model, and it's around the U.S. I can't remember exactly where it was started, but it's a wonderful program. And the whole idea with Inside Out is that it's I think a little bit different from what a lot of people think about, like a service learning course or this idea of volunteerism where you're going in to help somebody else who's at a lower status or a different, has different challenges that they're overcoming. With the Inside Out model, it's really a co-learning. So you're coming in as equals, you're meeting the material at the same time, and that one's not necessarily focused on any particular discipline. It's more about the engagement. And so we started talking about ways to incorporate criminal justice students into the work that we were doing with the Department of Juvenile Justice. We had about a 4-year program working with incarcerated youth in long-term facilities, and we realized that it was really fun and transformative, and it was something where not only are we bringing together, college students and more traditional college students and people who have been incarcerated or are continually still incarcerated, but also criminal justice students and theater students are not usually in the same rooms very often, and not studying the same material. And each brought their own levels of expertise, and each were challenged to go outside their sort of comfort zone in terms of how to meet the material. So it started small, but then, and one thing that Dr. Link said and was really important to her about it was that in the field of criminal justice, particularly at the undergraduate level, students can go 4 years and have all sorts of classes, but never have an actual engagement with someone who is system impacted or somebody who is within the system and sort of on the other end of the policies. And so this idea of sort of getting out of the textbook, and I think which is very driven by, a very traditional approach to talking about incarceration, and I think one that is less holistic and one that is less human driven. And so she really wanted her students to have that experience, and so that has been what we've been doing.
I have one more question from me, and then we'll switch over to Isabel. Prison education is, as I'm doing my research, it is a very controversial topic. A lot of people do not find that it is appropriate. What do you have to say to that? And then also, I'd like for you to touch on the vocabulary that you use when talking about incarcerated folks.
There was a time really leading up to the first Clinton administration, where prison education was fairly accessible, and there were grant-funded programs, and what's a real tragedy, and it worked. It was more focused on rehabilitation. People were able to get degrees while incarcerated, and of course that the statistics on, and I don't have the specifics, but anybody who has had any kind of educational programming while incarcerated has a much lower chance of recidivism than anybody that doesn't, and it's almost exponential in terms of the difference. Sometime around the whole, and this was all political, but sometime around the whole tough on crime movement, there were senators and politicians who really said, created the narrative, why are we using our taxpayer money to educate and support these offenders, these criminals, when my kid can't even get a college degree and pay for it? Why should we be paying for them? And it was the start of a real sort of tragic trajectory where the shaping of the narrative around incarceration became much more about warehousing and punishment versus, although that if you've talked to Dr. Vaught about the history of the United States, that's always been complicated, right? This idea of, what is it about? Is it about keeping our communities safe? Is it about punishment? Is there a chance for someone to rehabilitate? Is it about yeah, I mean, those different philosophies, and I would say it's interesting how it can change according to whatever the dominant political narrative is. As a result, there is on one hand, there's the idea of like, well, why should we give anything to these people who did horrible things, right? And that's more, I would say, the warehousing, and that's more of the idea of punishment. The fact is that model, the sort of super predator model of looking at criminalization, doesn't help our communities be safer because it just creates inhuman conditions, and then the people, the cycle of recidivism gets worse and worse, and the violence within the prisons, and it's grim. If you have nothing to live for, if you have no hope, what do you do? Not to say that that prison education is this silver bullet, this miracle thing, but it does make a difference. On the other hand, there's also people, from the more progressive side who say, well, prison education is perpetuating a system of mass incarceration, and you're making things a little bit better, but the whole system is messed up, and you're feeding the machine as opposed to reinventing a system that is flawed. I think Common Good Atlanta, it's very much focused on the individuals. It has grown, but we're talking about pretty small percentages of people who are able to be involved in it. There were small classes, and it takes a while to get through it. The point is that it is, there are a lot of political questions, and I think those questions are easier to sort of come down hard on one side or another. But when you're in the room, these are humans involved, and they may have 10 years on their sentence. They may have a life sentence. Shouldn't they have the right? Shouldn't they have the opportunity to get an education? And that is ultimately, I think, where my heart lies. Anyway, that's in terms of that question of why prison education and the controversy around it. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon in terms of those messages. But I do think that in little ways, bringing cracks to that narrative, because they're the ones that are going to be building the system ahead or infusing the system that's there. The other question you had about language, I think, is really important. The typical language in incarcerated sort of spaces is the offender, the criminal, the inmate, language that tends to dehumanize or name someone by their crime or by what they did, as opposed to who they are. We try to use terms like returning citizens for people who, particularly in the transitional phase, and or incarcerated citizens or incarcerated people, and system impacted. But there's so many people who have been impacted. Everybody is touched by it. We're all system impacted, whether we recognize it or not. Just some of us, I think, have more of a buffer zone than others.
So I was reading through the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Paroles, and I found something quite interesting. It said, successful reentry begins with the offender. And I found that interesting since you found a way to incorporate criminal justice students into some of your classes. So I just wanted to ask you, what is the importance of theater and the arts in rehabilitation?
First off, let me just say the statement of it begins with the offender. I think that is complicated. It is true, and I think our narratives tend to be focused more on like, well, they were able to do it, or oh, they just fell back into their old habits and they didn't succeed. What it ignores is just how unbelievable the barriers are for someone coming out of incarceration, and structural challenges, some things that you don't even think about, logistical challenges, something as simple as trying to get a driver's license so you can get to a job, getting hired in a job, having to check the box to say that you particularly if anybody who has a felony who has been incarcerated for more than a year. There are so many barriers, and so yes, it does start with the person who is coming out, and but it's almost inhuman to think, what someone has to get through to be able to succeed. And so I think something that is really great about Common Good Atlanta, and something I've heard, just sort of in terms of what distinguishes Common Good from from some other prison education programs that are less personal, I guess, is that it really builds a network of people and a community for once someone gets out. And we try to make it possible for someone, if they begin the program on the inside, to be able to finish on the outside. We've had some hiccups with that in terms of what the Georgia Department of Corrections will allow in terms of who can be in the same classes, how to do it. I think it's a big moment, and it is on the one hand really freeing. On the other hand, it can be overwhelming. And ultimately, I believe that we do it in a way, hopefully, that's playful and is non-threatening enough to create a sense of welcome, create a sense of hospitality. So this was a quote about listening is a sacrament when the topic is important, and when strife divides people in small spaces, the sacrament of listening is vital. I feel like we're in a really honored place to be in a room, to be able to listen to people from experiences, particularly people who have been invisible, sort of put away from the world for multiple years, sometimes decades. This other one, which is we seek to practice the art of hospitality in places of hostility, and in doing so, practice kindness in places most in need of kindness. And that's sort of my personal ethic in this classroom, is how do we create hospitality? Certainly everybody that's coming through has survived places of real hostility. And so how do we change that space? And I think theater is a good reason.
Thank you so much for all of your input. This is very insightful.
Thank you so
All right.
much.
All right,
Thank you
thanks,
so much.
Isabel.
Thank you, Margaret. Many individuals struggle to reintegrate back into society after incarceration. The stigma around having a criminal record can make it challenging to get a job and reestablish connections in the outside world. There's also a lack of resources and funding. Churchwell identifies some solutions to these issues and offers insight on how Georgia can improve their programs and help lower recidivism rates. Dr. Beverly Reese Churchwell is an associate professor and the current criminal justice program coordinator in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice. Dr. Churchwell is a KSU alumna, and this is where she received her Bachelor in Science and Criminal Justice. Her areas of expertise include institutional corrections and reentry, distance from crime, through the life course of theoretical perspective, and juvenile delinquency.
Welcome, everyone. Today we have Dr. Churchwell with us. She is an associate professor and a criminal justice program coordinator at KSU. She also earned her bachelor in criminal justice there. She holds both a master and a PhD in criminal justice and criminology from the Georgia State University. Before returning to KSU as a professor, she taught at the Appalachian State University in North Carolina, and her areas of expertise are institutional corrections and reentry, distance from crime, and juvenile delinquency. Her professional background includes working as a state court clerk in Cobb County and as a paralegal for the Georgia State Patrol. She is also a court-appointed, special advocate for CASA in Cherokee County. She has also worked with research and also like grants. She has worked with the sexual violence prevention and child safety for the Georgia Department of Public Health. She also has worked with data analysis for BREA with the North Carolina Department of Corrections. Also worked with research for inmate reentry with the Gwinnett County Jail, and mentorship programs for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. You also have some awards and recognitions for like Student Organization Advisor of the Year, Outstanding Engagement and Alumni Awards, and also named Faculty Honoree by students for Outstanding Senior and Scholar Awards. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
No, thank you. I appreciate y'all interviewing me for this. I think just my education, just going through the Bachelor's of Criminal Justice program at Kennesaw State, that is really what led me to where I am today. So I started as a pre-law major, and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be an attorney. That's why I was working as a clerk and then as a paralegal. And then I saw how much work goes into being an attorney. I mean, for a lack of a better word, how you're gone, long days in court, you're in the office long days, and it just wasn't quite calling to me. I started taking criminal justice classes though to help me prepare for law school, but then I soon became very interested in just learning more about the system and participating in research. Went on for my master's, decided I did want to do research and teach criminal justice because I enjoy teaching. That is kind of the other thing I always wanted to do. And I also, though, was very just passionate about learning more about the system. So
How does limited access to rehabilitation programs and rehabilitation resources affect juveniles' ability to reintegrate after they're released?
we're talking about youth specifically, right, and reintegrating them. So I'm thinking we're talking about a population that's held in facilities. So that is ran by the Georgia Department of Juvenile Justice. And we have around 1,000, I think in 2022, it was a little less than 1,000 youth that are held in secure facilities across the state. And so these facilities are youth detention centers, regional youth detention centers. There's 19 of those, I believe, 6 youth developmental campuses across the state of Georgia. And then in addition, though, to that secure detention, we also serve over 50,000 youth annually through probation or maybe a short stint in incarceration and community-based programs. So we have done a good job about reducing youth secure confinement because historically we were confining youth for things that we really shouldn't have been confining them for, right? Instead of alternatively doing probation or something like that, instead we're confining them for status offenses, which are offenses related to the youth status, so like drinking underage or curfew. So we really wanted to move away from that. Having limited access to rehabilitation services for reintegration. So when I say rehabilitation services, I mean things such as education and substance abuse, and education especially because you're pulling them out of school, right? Education, if they have a substance abuse problem, mental health care, any vocational training, especially as they get older, not having that really undermines their ability to successfully reintegrate when they come out of those detention facilities. They're more likely to reoffend, they're less likely to complete school, they're more likely to have mental health struggles because they've just been confined. And if that wasn't addressed, they probably already had many times mental health struggles to begin with. Homelessness is another thing, and just strain with reconnecting with the community and their family.
Kind of some of the research that I've done on this topic was talking about how often, like you were saying, if the issues aren't addressed, then a lot of times they will become recidivist, they will end up back in the system. So in 2014, the Georgia lawmakers and other lawmakers in the United States appropriated $5 million to expand their evidence-based programs to kind of help address this issue. And then later in 2018, data showed a reduction in recidivism rates as a whole. And so they were saying that the largest contributing factor to the reduction in those recidivism rates was something they implemented called the Juvenile Justice Incentive Grant Program. Do you know anything about this program?
I know that the Juvenile Justice Incentive Grant Program, it did expand access to evidence-based community programs. There are, though, reports that funding hasn't really kept pace with that growing demand that they have. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that's kind of where we're at now with this, and especially when we're starting to see federal grants go away. So that money is going away, right? So it's left to the states. So the states have to pick up that slack, and the states already have limited resources for these things as well. So it kind of remains to be seen what's going to happen from here, to be honest. And we're already lacking resources, to be honest. Even with these great initiatives that we've had, we still have a lack of resources.
Do you think that there are transitional services in place that are adequately supporting reentry as of right now?
So I think there are transitional services. It varies greatly depending on the location, the availability of resources, the state, the funding, all of that. And again, funding is another thing that's going to continue to be an issue. So ideally, we would have good case management in place, right? Starting before release, we would have a plan. And so there's no gaps when an individual reintegrates back. So some sort of reentry planning case plan that starts before release. There are educational programs, there's housing assistance at times. I know there was Georgia Fresh Start Youth Initiative, which was employment readiness training that was operated by the Georgia Department of Juvenile Justice for those who were formerly supervised in the community or currently supervised in the community, just to help them transition back, as well as family reunification counseling. Sometimes you see that as well. So there are some things in place. I don't know if I mentioned the Yes Georgia program, and they help with GED, preparing for GED, because again, if you're confined, right, you are lacking that at times when you don't have access to your regular school system.
What improvements do you think could be made to strengthen this reintegration outcomes that there is right now with the programs available in Georgia?
I think it's just the funding. It goes back to that we have that grant program, but the resources are still lacking. So in an ideal world, how we could strengthen reintegration outcomes is, number one, incarcerate the individuals that need to be incarcerated. The ones that really do have a public, have this public safety risk and need to be detained for safety reasons. So detaining the right individuals, not detaining individuals for lower level offenses, having a plan in place very early on for reentry before they leave, having a stronger collaboration between juvenile justice agencies and community services. Those tend to sometimes, it depends, and again, it depends on the jurisdiction. I've seen some jurisdictions work really closely with their community agencies and help individuals reintegrate, like, hey, there's this program that's run by this church that provides housing or help with food, connecting them to those resources. Having someone in that community that knows all those resources is very important. And considering any trauma, any mental health concerns, making sure those are addressed, making sure housing, so mental health, housing, and any substance abuse problems, those are kind of the big three that need to have those resources expanded to them, and just funding incentives for community-based alternatives to incarceration. So instead of, again, detaining individuals, investing in prevention and diversion programs is what would be most helpful for those, especially lower level offenders.
I agree. Actually, some of the research articles that I saw, they said that especially the Georgia correctional system have spent more than $1 billion on, incarcerating individuals, things like that, and the recidivism rate has kind of improved a little bit, like when it comes to, like, it has decreased. However, there's stuff that still needs to be made compared to other states. For example, I also researched a little bit about North Carolina just because you have some experience with it. I did see that their recidivism rate is, I think, about 40%, and like the Georgia one is like about like 26, I believe. So there's still a lot that Georgia needs to like implement. I have seen also like there is, states like Missouri and Oregon that have like decreased their recidivism rate like a lot, just by what you said, like by what, like alternatives to like incarceration, funding more towards like probation. There's other alternatives that are not as costly, and just like accountability courts, drug courts, things like that could be made, and to like reform these people that are like not violent, and also like kind of like decrease the cost that like taxpayers overall are the ones that like pay on that. So
Right.
I do agree with that. I wanted to ask you, especially because you have both experience in like a state kind of department and also like county, kind of like what are the differences between these facilities and how does that affect programming?
With youth in particular, we usually have them in those state facilities. If they're detained, they're going to be in those state, or if they're confined, they're going to be in those state facilities like the youth developmental campuses in Georgia. Sometimes they will, if they're, first arrested, they'll be in county jails. So youth are detained in county jails usually for pretrial purposes, or if for other special circumstances. So we do have youth in jail that are supposed to be separated from sight and sound from adults. So they're not supposed to be in the cell with adults. No one's there monitoring everything
Not
at all
always
times
the
to make
case.
sure that that's what's happening, right? But yeah, so there's differences for sure, right? Because a jail is all about security and making sure like people are where they're supposed to be. So usually there's not as much programming. So I would speculate here that there's going to be minimal to no programming in county jails for youth, very limited access to education. In your youth development centers, you're going to have more of that rehabilitation component. You're going to have more education and GED prep, counseling, CBT, right, is very important. One of the most important evidence-based things you can do to reintegrate an individual is cognitive behavioral therapy and changing those criminogenic thinking patterns. That is kind of the top of the line. What you need to be doing is CBT and trauma-informed care. Jails, I have seen jails with reentry planning. That's not always great, but there are efforts that have been made. Usually the youth detention centers, they're going to be more likely to have some reentry planning. You're there longer, right? So if you're confined in a YDC, you're confined there for a period of time, where if you're just pre-trial in a jail, you might not be there very long before you bond out. So there's definitely differences there. And then just, staffing and training, right? Like if you're in a jail, you're with your county deputies. They're not trained specifically to help juveniles with their issues and help rehabilitate juveniles in any way, where if you're at a YDC, they're going to have staff with more training and things such as like adolescent development and education and those things. So there are definite differences between being held in a detention center and then going to a YDC.
You said that when it comes to jail, there's not a lot of programming. However, based on like your professional knowledge and even like personal opinion, do you think it will be like a better option that will yield better results if they start like programming when they're in jail, kind of like to avoid further like criminal behavior, if that makes sense?
I think any type of at least referral. So some of the problems I've seen, even with mostly adults and reintegrating from jail, is they're gone before anyone can even make contact with them to see what their reentry needs are. They've already left the jail. Those, though, that are going to be held for a longer period of time, I think definitely those are the ones you would want to target the most. I think the ones that are leaving quickly, you want to try to connect them with as many resources as possible, give them, even if it's just a sheet of paper of like, hey, here are places you can contact when you're released. A lot of times they may be supervised by a juvenile probation officer, so the juvenile probation officer can help with those types of things as well. But yeah, I think if you're held there, even if it's a jail, I have seen reentry programs in jails. They do exist. Usually they're for adults, but any programming, anything that is evidence-based, right? Not just any programming, because that can sometimes be harmful if it's not helpful, right? But if it's evidence-based and it's needed, and you follow those R&R principles, risk needs principles, making sure that those are things that they actually need for their rehabilitation, that certainly is important.
I think that was honestly everything that I had. So I enjoyed like finally, kind of like having this time to like have this conversation, know a little bit more about like not only like more about your personal opinion, like what you have seen in your work and all your experience throughout these years. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, your insight on everything. We appreciate it so much.
I really appreciate it. It was good to meet with you all. Thank you so much.
Dr. Churchwell briefly discussed the Georgia Fresh Start Youth Initiative, which speaks about employment readiness training that was operated by Georgia Department of Juvenile Justice for those who are formerly incarcerated or currently supervised in the community, just to help them transition back. Legal barriers also play a big role in recidivism rates as well. I was reading on a source that argues that Georgia's current outdated record restriction laws limit incarcerated individuals access to fair employment, which calls for reform that would give ex-offenders a true second chance. Hands-on support is important. Getting out is one thing, but getting on your feet is another. The dissertation that I read about this topic specifically highlights how employment isn't just about income, it's an important factor in preventing recidivism.
Whether it's the lack of funding or resources to prison education,
the struggles that incarcerated individuals face in reintegrating back into society,
barriers to employment, rehabilitation for individuals is constantly challenged in the state of Georgia.
As human services practitioners, we have a duty to work beyond the barriers and see people in this population as not criminals, but members of our society that deserve to be treated as such.
currently there are 2 nonprofits that are working to bridge this gap for rehabilitation. One includes RED, Rehabilitation Enables Dreams, and Common Good Atlanta. For more information, please check them out. And until next time, this has been
The Journey's Home Podcast.